This is one of the city's shelters for asylum seekers, but even though it's below freezing in New York right now, people in shelters like this are being told they may be evicted and have to leave.
And the freezing temperatures come as hundreds of asylum seekers are evicted from city shelters and wait for placement.
But the Arctic temperatures not keeping migrants from standing on long lines for hours, some even spending the night.
Very cold.
He was evicted from his homeless shelter after 30 days.
The clock is ticking for Jennifer Vargas and her 3 kids. In just weeks, they'll be evicted.
They told me I would have support finding work. They told me I would have support with my children. Those were lies.
Around 170,000 people have come to New York City seeking asylum, and that's why the city is continuing to evict people from shelters, not just single adults, but also families. Humanitarian advocates say this is a disaster waiting to happen because people are standing in lines all over the city waiting for help, and it's freezing all day long. This could contribute to medical emergencies.
And one can wait for hours out here just to get inside and be told to come back. Some even spending the night, all to receive shelter.
That's an unfortunate situation to see so many people waiting outside in the freezing cold. City leadership says this is unavoidable because the shelter system is completely full. And while this is happening, folks continue arriving here in New York from the southern border, which last month experienced record numbers. 225,000 people apparently. And this is puzzling New York City's leaders who figured that freezing cold temperatures would actually contribute to less housing requests under the city's right to shelter rules, but that hasn't happened. And the laws in New York obligate the city to provide temporary room and board to anyone who asks. But since the shelters are full, you've got no more room in any of them, and now there's a revolving door type system where people have to wait in line for a new bed to open up after they've lost their bed after a certain period of time, because there's not enough time for everyone to have one permanently. But before we uncover why the city's evicting people from shelters in the freezing cold, it's important to first understand how it is that people are still getting to New York City. Because just last month, the city's mayor banned buses from dropping people off, but that doesn't really seem to be working. People are still coming. So here we are at Grand Central, one of New York City's 2 train stations, and something crazy has happened now that buses are no longer allowed to drop people off in the city. Train stations like this are actually the new arrival points, along with roads and airports. But because so many trains arrive at stations like this, things are actually harder for humanitarian advocates that are helping new arrivals. And that's because instead of arriving at one specific location like the bus terminal, which had one specific drop-off location, new arrivals are now spread between 2 different train stations with multiple floors in different parts of the city. And instead of coming from one specific location, people can come from almost anywhere. This is where we're located, Grand Central. And look, you got trains coming in from New Jersey and from upstate New York, as well as locations in Connecticut. Here in New York, you've got trains basically going up and down the East Coast. People could be coming from any arrival point throughout the entire country, and that's making it tough for the families as well. And because the flow of new arrivals to New York City hasn't been stopping, people are now being asked to leave the shelters so that new folks can take their place.
That's proof that there are ways around a new executive order which places restrictions on when and how buses carrying migrants can arrive in the city.
So America's a massive country. It's so connected. Roads, bridges, trains, planes, everything. If you want to get somewhere, it's possible. Now that buses can't bring passengers to the city anymore, folks will take a bus as far as they can and then take a train the rest of the way. Some bus companies are even paying for tickets on behalf of their passengers. But this particular station has proven to be very popular with new arrivals because it's close to the asylum processing center where people have to go anyways after they arrive. And even though other states like New Jersey have made similar orders to the bus companies, there are so many ways to get to New York that folks are still finding a way to make the journey, even if it's much longer than it was previously. Now, it's worth noting that the mayor of New Jersey didn't actually ban buses, but he did tell the bus companies that he wants 32-hour notice, and he could easily give them an executive order that makes them abide by that rule, and companies have been complying. New Jersey is down to about 1 or 2 buses a day from 8 buses a day, but again, that hasn't stopped New York City's train stations from being as active as they are. But critics say this is just pushing drop-off points out further and further, which makes it tougher and tougher for people to make a journey they've already decided they're going to make.
I asked this woman how long long she's been waiting for this all to come together. A long time, she said. This young man says he drove from New York City to pick up his extended family here in New Jersey.
I just thank God that they made it.
These folks are incredibly lucky to have family in the United States already, but one thing that's important to remember is that even though it's cold and freezing out, people still think New York City is the best destination for them versus anywhere else in the entire country. And that's because the infrastructure that exists around the asylum crisis here eclipses most other parts of the country. In New York, not only can you get a place to stay under the city's right to shelter rules, but a lot of the shelters where people are staying make it easy for folks to connect with caseworkers to process asylum applications, get work permission. It's an easier process here, even though it might be harder to get here. And even though the shelters are now revolving door operations, where one person needs to leave so another person can get a spot, it's still many people's best option once you consider where they're from. A majority of asylum seekers are from Venezuela, where monthly salaries are around $140 US. But this is unfortunately putting people in dangerous situations. Look at this, 78 degrees right there in Venezuela, and here you got snow on the cars. But not only is travel to New York City now more difficult at the absolute worst time of year, critics are saying that the mayor's decision to ban buses has had other unintended consequences, in addition to the shelter evictions, which we'll get to.
Because now with this executive order, we kind of have to be all over the place trying to find the migrants because they're now scattered.
Scattered, but clearly still coming to America.
So when you consider these folks and where they're from, it's hard to feel like they're doing anything many people wouldn't consider doing if they were in the same situation. But it seems like the city's decision to restrict travel so that they can better help the folks that are here has just made more bad decisions have to happen down the line. For example, the mayor is now thinking of how to restrict train travel, but nobody's quite sure how that would work because trains have routes. People get on, people get off. There's many different arrival points, many different departure points, and there's always the option of a ride share for the latter half of the journey. On top of that, many advocates say it might be unfair to restrict someone's ability to travel based on where they might be from. On top of that, arrival totals a month ago were estimated at around 160,000 folks. Now it's around 170,000 total folks, which is why the shelter system is overburdened and why families are being asked to leave. Here we are at the Roosevelt Hotel. It's not just an emergency shelter. This is also the processing location for folks who've just arrived in the city, so everyone has to come here. And not only is this a 1,000 room facility that can house folks who need a place to stay, people who get evicted from other shelters have to come here to reapply for housing if they're a family. And there doesn't seem to be much of a line outside here today, and that's a good thing because it's freezing out. But if you're a single adult, right now there's a line of people at their reapplication center, and not only is it freezing out, but people are out there for sometimes 7-8 hours a day.
Very cold.
He was evicted from his homeless shelter after 30 days, per the mayor's new edict. Here, he received a number, his spot in line to be relocated to a new shelter.
Oh, that is crazy. Again, it's good that there's no line here because there are families with kids in facilities like this, but to be waiting outside like that all day, not even really moving, man, that's dangerous. And just the idea of people being out in the cold sounds cruel and unusual. And the city obviously has space for families to wait inside while they go through the reapplication process. Surely a solution like this that gets people out of the weather has to be possible for single adults too. And critics say it would probably be cheaper to have everyone in one location instead of to have them traveling between multiple spots that all need different sets of staff to just do the same thing. Especially when you consider that frostbite in the cold is a real thing. And to many advocates, it looks like there's a two-tier system. One system for families and another system for single adults that looks like it's run in a completely different way for reasons that don't really make a whole lot of sense. And the facility for single adults doesn't have bathrooms people can use while they wait in line for hours. There were bathrooms in a park across the street, but the city decided to stop maintaining them and remove them. And if you look at the difference in these two reapplication processes as forced shelter, it's almost like one group of people has it a lot tougher than the other.
Asylum seekers wrapped in layers of clothes try to pass the time. This man tells us he will likely spend the night on the streets.
So the sad reality of this is, unless this archaic system of having people wait outside in the cold changes, people are gonna get sick. But with this process, lines are the normal. You've got families waiting in line to do other things like getting ID cards, for example. And even though New York claims it's a model for how to effectively care for people in a cold environment, New York doesn't do what Chicago does, and they use warming buses, warming vans. It's a bus set up outside one of those long lines in a cold environment with the heat on inside. Folks can take turns going in, getting warm, maybe even using the bathroom if the bus happens to have one, but that's not the case here. Now, at the Roosevelt Hotel, we don't need warming buses because, again, very few people outside, just people that are on their way in or out of the building. No line at either entrance. And no matter what time of of day it is, you can wait in here and stay warm while you wait for a placement. But if you're a single adult, you've actually got to leave that East Village facility because it closes in the evening, and you've got to go an hour uptown to the Bronx, where there is a respite center, not a shelter, where people unfortunately have to hang out on the floor or in a chair or something, and they've got to be out by 6 a.m. the next day. And unlike a hotel, that respite center doesn't have showers in it either, which means some asylum seekers are conceivably out in the cold for 5 days with no shower or no bath. And it's crazy to imagine that these conditions exist in America, in a city that guarantees a right to shelter for people who come here, but they don't even have a place to brush their teeth for almost a week, which is causing many asylum seekers to feel like they've been lied to. So here we are a few blocks away from the Roosevelt Hotel Processing Center, and this is the New York City that a lot of people envision. Tall buildings, little shops, just this unique environment that has possibly been seen in a movie or in a magazine at some point. This is what people think of, but it's not the reality that many asylum seekers are now experiencing.
The trek home from school for these mothers and their kids can feel a little bit longer and a lot colder the longer they stay at Floyd Bennett Field.
That's not a place that's for children. It's not a decent place for children.
So the sad reality of all of this is that a placement in the Roosevelt Hotel, which is like one of the best shelters you can get access to, it's not guaranteed. And when families have to leave that facility, the future becomes very uncertain. And that's because the city's other shelter options look like this one at Randall's Island, which isn't anywhere near all the tall buildings. These are actually referred to as congregate shelters because you're in a big congregation type setting. Here are some pictures of the inside. This is a shelter for single adults, but now families are being moved into places like this. There's other people, everyone can kind of see each other. It's not really a whole lot of privacy, and some of these shelters have bathroom facilities that are outside the main building, and it's hard to imagine families trying to exist in communal living arrangements, especially when those very same folks thought they were on their way to New York City, which looks like this. Loud music, noise, people having conversations. I honestly couldn't imagine living in a situation like that myself.
The immigrants faced with some tough living conditions, no questions about it.
Wind rattled the tents at the migrant shelter as rain leaked in on December 17th.
Now, it's important to remember that the folks in videos like this, many of them were staying at places like the Row Hotel or the Roosevelt, which are a private room where you have your own bathroom and you have your own space to kind of live your own life. And now that's all gone away. And when you think about it, being able to stay in a former luxury hotel down the street from everything we're looking at right now, it's almost like this is too good to be true. And it is for 60 days, but then it could end and you could have to move out and go someplace much tougher. On top of that, the city may be creating a situation with the shelter evictions, which inadvertently ends up trapping people in the system itself, and they'll never be able to get out of it. Because these tent shelters are hours away from the heart of the city where we are right now. This is where the work opportunity is. This is where the jobs are, but now you can't get here anymore. How are you supposed to self-sustain and get out of the shelters, which is what the city wants? And it's where a lot of children get placed in school, but there aren't any buses to bring them to the school. The city does have a $600,000 contract with bus companies to bring people every 90 minutes from that big tent shelter to public transportation, but apparently the buses don't always show up and people miss school.
They told me I would have support finding work. They told me I would have support with my children. Those were lies.
The clock is ticking for Jennifer.
So if that turns out to be true, it could be that the city isn't properly explaining to people what's going to happen after they get here and have to move to a new place. And that's why folks feel like they're being lied to. After all, if the city tells you they'll do their best to find a great place for you to stay, and they'll do their best to help you find a job and give you all this support, if you've got no other options, you might just wait and see if that actually happens. But unfortunately, these parents say it's not. And that's why right now the city's comptroller is investigating how the city handles evictions. But it gets even worse. Let's say you're a family and you're at one of these tent-style shelters. After 60 days there, you still may have to move out and get replaced elsewhere. So that's another move. But the city is firm on its eviction rules, and it's standing by this process. Because apparently 80% of single adults who leave the shelters never end up coming back to reapply. But many families are afraid they and their kids could be out on the streets.
It's the city's latest move to urge migrants to find permanent housing, but with what help, asks another mother. Aymar says it's been a struggle to apply for work authorization.
Right, so a full-time mom with kids is now in a situation where after 60 days, they're expected to self-sustain somehow. Now, the city says many folks who end up leaving the shelters connect with family or relatives elsewhere in the country. But that's certainly not something that can be expected of everyone. People are gonna need jobs, they're gonna need childcare, that's expensive, and they're gonna have to get set up in an environment that allows them to get all those things. They can't be moving around every couple of months. And even though the city has guaranteed that families are not going to be sleeping on the streets in any capacity, many people think the alternative of tent shelters and rolling evictions that trap people indefinitely aren't really a good solution either. There was one article written about a family that saved up enough money to move out of the shelters and get themselves an apartment, but the apartment wasn't in New York, it was in New Jersey, and it took them a year of saving, and the father was working. How can a single mom do the same thing? On top of that, new rules are being put into effect at some of the city shelters, which are going to restrict some people's ability to hold on to jobs if they can even find them. So here we are at the Row Hotel, one of the city's other shelters, and although there's no curfew at this facility yet, curfews have been put into place at other shelters here in the city, and that's causing problems for people who have jobs that require them to work during those curfew hours.
Controversy tonight over a new curfew for asylum seekers in New York City.
4 centers, 2 in Queens, 1 in Brooklyn, and another in Harlem, will restrict residents from leaving between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m.
Now, proponents of curfews say that this shouldn't be controversial because there are already curfews at the shelters that are used for homeless New Yorkers, which are in a different system than the one behind me. But you see all these delivery bikes out here? These are here because delivery is one of the only jobs people can get if they've recently come here. And a lot of delivery jobs require people to be working when people don't want to go and buy things or pick them up for themselves. And that's got folks who are in a situation where they're trying to save up some money and get out of the shelter system worried about what they're going to do. Because a lot of folks that are staying in places like this can't just go out and get a 9-to-5 salaried job. Not that somebody in a traditional shelter can go and do the same thing easily, but there's a point to be made that folks in places like the Row Hotel have less opportunity than their counterparts. But on the plus side, the city says this is helpful because it helps them manage the available bed space that they do have. After all, if somebody leaves one of the shelters, they may just pack up their things and leave, and the city might reserve a place for them to stay when they don't need it anymore.
Edwin Mendoza tells me he came to the city to escape gang violence in Ecuador 3 months ago. He has been able to find work as a delivery worker, but the company he works for wants him to work primarily at night, after the new 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew begins.
So this is definitely not an ideal situation, and now families are starting to worry that they might not be able to hold on to the jobs they've worked so hard to get. Now, luckily, the new curfew strategy does allow for exceptions, but how do you get an exception to work if you're in the gig economy? You're technically self-employed, running your own business. You don't actually have to be anywhere unless you have some sort of contract, but that's not something everybody's going to be able to produce. And with families being forced to leave facilities like this, it's almost like this whole situation is just getting worse for everybody involved. Is the city doing the right thing by asking families to leave hotels where they've been living for almost 2 months? And what could they do instead to better manage this crisis? Let me know. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.